Welcome to our Sentinel Hub webinar. Today we'll be talking about open source intelligence and the increasing availability of satellite data, which has become a fact-checking tool. As you already know, open source intelligence is information derived from publicly available data, such as online images and videos, vehicle tracking, or remote sensing. It can help verify or refute content from news outlets and social media to support truthful reporting on sensitive issues. This webinar will demonstrate the identification of time and location of events as an operation involving multiple sources of openly available information. The topic today will be presented by our special guest, Eliot Higgins, founder and creative director of Bellingcat. Eliot founded Bellingcat in 2014, which has grown over the years from a single staff member and a team of volunteers to a Netherlands-based NGO with 30 employees from around the world. Their work has led the way in developing the use of online open source investigations in a wide variety of fields, from journalism to justice and accountability, and is widely recognized as a leader in the development of online open source investigations. We'll conclude with a Q&A session, which will also include Pierre Marcus and Andras Zlinski. My name is Sabina Dolintz, and I'm part of Sentinel Hub team, and I'll try to make sure that our webinar runs as smoothly as possible. That's it from my side. Enjoy today's presentation. Eliot, it's really an honor to have you as a guest today, and I'll turn the floor over to you now.
Hi, everyone. So today I'm going to talk to you about open source investigation, in particular in the context of the conflicts in Ukraine, because really what we've seen over the last 18 months or so has really shown how open source investigation really has come of age in many senses. And it really started even before the conflict began, where we had a situation where there's lots of information and points and counterpoints being made about whether or not Russia was really going to invade Ukraine. We had the Ukrainian government officially denying it. The US government was very concerned and putting out information. But we had lots of information that was being shared online by Russians themselves that actually provided useful context around what was happening. So this is just 3 videos from hundreds of videos from inside Russia, close to the border with Ukraine, showing Russian troop movements. And various communities very early on, as these videos were being shared, started geolocating them, identifying the units and the vehicles that are visible in these videos. And from that, conclusions could be built about the buildup. So one thing we were seeing is early on, these military camps building up, supposedly, according to the Russians, as part of scheduled exercises. But in the week just before the actual invasion began, we saw more videos showing these vehicles moving closer and closer to the border. And it included units that you wouldn't expect to be part of military exercises, so things like military police and medical units. And various organizations made an effort to map that. So this is a map that was created by the Center for Information Resilience. And each of these green dots represents a video that was shared online in the week prior to the invasion. Some you'll see are in Russian-occupied Crimea, Donetsk and Luhansk, but many of them are around the Russian border, and a lot are very close to the Russian border. You can actually access this map online. It has a massive amount of data covering the entire conflict, broken down by different kinds of incidents, as you can see listed on the right-hand side. Here I've just selected those very specific set of videos. And each click, for example, each dot you can click on and see the original video, the context of it, and other information about it. So this was a very early mapping effort to help understand where these videos were being filmed and how they would unfold, how the conflict was unfolding. And this is important for a number of reasons, because it also allows us to see where the positions of Russian military units when these attacks began in Ukraine. And as we've been doing a lot of work around Ukraine, we've been focused on ideas around legal accountability. So understanding which military units were where at this moment is very useful for connecting that to potential crimes that have occurred. Other videos were being published as well. So this is a video that was published online by the Donetsk People's Republic. It was shared on a Telegram channel. As you can see, you can't see much that's going on. There's gunfire, there's an explosion, and quite a lot of grass. There's a flare shooting. and it doesn't really show much. But the context the People's Republic, the Donetsk People's Republic gave was that there was a group of saboteurs who spoke Polish for some reason, working for the Ukrainians. They were trying to blow up a container with chlorine and trying to trigger basically a chemical incident. And this was a kind of theme in early propaganda coming from Russia, that the Ukrainians were trying to create some kind of chemical incident. Now, what's very different from, say, 2014, when Russia first kind of sent troops into Ukraine and pretended not to be in Ukraine, was that there's now a community of hundreds and likely thousands of people who just are engaged with this kind of information, and they dig through it. And they also understand through the work of organizations like Bellingcat how you can analyze this stuff. One thing that Donetsk People's Republic didn't understand is, unlike other social media platforms that strip metadata, Telegram doesn't do that. So this video that was uploaded in the middle of February had all its metadata. And this is just a small selection of some of that metadata. And what all this information is you're seeing is basically from Adobe. And it's all the metadata about how this file was created. There's tons of stuff in here, and this kind of group of people who just formed on Twitter around this particular video started digging through it. And there were certain things that stood out. So, for example, the creation date was more than a week before the incident supposedly took place. You actually have here the project path it was created in, and the project was created in 2022. The software agent here is explaining, it was using Adobe Premiere Pro to edit the video. And in one very interesting line here, this pantry ingredients file path has a file name. And a lot of people immediately recognize this as the likely source of this as being YouTube, because if you use like a video downloading tool on YouTube or the common web-based ones, it usually downloads it as the file name of the YouTube video, and you can just plug that into YouTube and immediately find this video from 2010 of Finnish soldiers at a firing range using these particular weapons. And what some people did who are part of this community, they analyzed the audio, the waveforms of the explosions in this video and the video that was shared by the Donetsk People's Republic, and showed that they had copy and pasted these waveforms from this video into the faked video. So effectively, we had this blueprint. And within an hour, nearly all this information was discovered, shared, talked about on social media. And that had a kind of preventative effect, because before this disinformation could really enter the kind of alternative media ecosystem, where, once a piece of information gets in there, it becomes kind of, believed to be true, and it's very hard to debunk it. It didn't really get across that barrier. So this was never really a piece of information that got picked up because of this rapid debunking. And there were multiple cases where, because there was this rapid debunking done, it stopped that kind of piece of information entering. Another example is a supposed car bomb that killed a car full of civilians. Yet when a local kind of video blogger came and filmed inside the cars, it was very noticeable that the skeletons in this burnt out car had autopsy cuts on their skull, and their rib cages had been removed, and they were autopsied corpses they'd put in the car, set it on fire, fired a machine gun into it to look like shrapnel holes, and then pretended to be an IED attack. You also had something that was quite unique about this conflict, a community grow around geolocation of videos. So videos would be shared online, and rapidly you'd have various accounts geolocating it. GeoConfirmed, which you can see here, is still very active geolocating videos all the time. And that's valuable for us because we've created a process at Bellingcat using this platform called Atlos with our global authentication project, where we train a small group of volunteers to geolocate videos, give them vicarious trauma training, and we can set queues of tasks of videos to verify. And when we've had these videos already geolocated on social media, that gets double checked and verified. And then we have another step where we have a full-time Bellingcat staff member also review it. And we've been adding this to this Ukraine civilian harm map we've created, which is not dissimilar to the Center for Information Resilience map, but it's more focused on incidents of civilian harm. So we verify these videos using the Atlos platform with our volunteers, and then after a certain period of time, we add it to the platform. We're not trying to create real-time data because that creates risks such as providing targeting information to those people doing the attacks. But a lot of this early work we're doing is recognizing that a lot of this material from the early days of conflict can be very valuable for future legal accountability efforts and raising awareness around what's actually happening in the conflict. But also a lot of this content gets removed fairly quickly. So we're archiving this material along with geolocating it. And you can search for this map. It's at ukraine.bellingcat.com and look at some of this data yourself. But there's different kinds of disinformation that came about early on in the conflict. There was a maternity hospital that was bombed, and 2 women became a kind of feature of this. There was this woman who was photographed coming downstairs, and a second woman who was shown being taken away. She sadly later died from her injuries, but this became a huge topic for disinformation. So you had various social media accounts making claims that the woman who was featured was an actress. She was the same woman who was taken away on a stretcher. She had a social media account where she was, a kind of very small influencer. But there's a pattern of behavior that we've observed for years. The Russian Federation loves picking up conspiracy theories on the internet and amplifying them. So this is the Russian embassy in the UK amplifying these same conspiracy theories. And this next clip I'll show is from a Dutch television show where the Russian ambassador to the Netherlands is basically explaining these theories.
Let me just illustrate what I said about the disinformation war.
So to be clear there, the Russian ambassador to the Netherlands is using comments on the victim's Instagram posts as evidence that this is a forgery, this is a fake. And sadly, it's not. As I said, one of the victims died after this. But this is just one of many examples of the Russian Federation using conspiracy theories off the internet. And this is why it's so important to be able to debunk even what seems to be fringe theories as rapidly as possible, because before you know it, the Russians are saying it's real and presenting it on television and at the UN Security Council. Fortunately, Bellingcat has had the opportunity over the last several years to do a vast amount of training with a wide variety of organizations, including media organizations. This has then led to organizations such as CNN, the New York Times, the BBC, and many others setting up their own open source investigation teams. Often they're called visual investigation teams because there's a lot of visual material used, but a lot of this is through the training we've done with Bellingcat. We've now trained several thousand investigators from a variety of backgrounds to do this kind of work, and we're now really seeing those investigators play a big role in understanding the conflict in Ukraine. One incident that we were able to use Sentinel satellite imagery to investigate was this attack that destroyed a supermarket in Ukrainian-held territory. And again, we had the Russian Federation who shared various information about this incident. As you can see, the whole building was destroyed, but Russia denied that this was the case, that they had in fact hit a ammo depot with precision ammunition. And they hit 2 targets, and a secondary explosion had caused the fire at the shopping centre. And we investigated it, but again, this idea of trying to respond as quickly as possible is very, very important. So Russia was making those claims on the morning of June 28th. Well, at the same time, thanks to Sentinel-2 satellite imagery, we were able to actually look at the 2 sites, or rather the 3 sites they claimed to have hit, and showed that this was not the case. There were actually 2 sites that were destroyed. The railway station had no damage done to it whatsoever, despite Russia's claims. And we could respond to this very, very quickly because we had this satellite imagery at short notice. One thing I've always been kind of very interested in is how quickly we can get access to this kind of imagery. Several years ago, we did an investigation that looked at cross-border artillery strikes by Russia in Ukraine, and this was during the summer of 2014, at a time where Russia denied any kind of cross-border artillery attacks were occurring. What we were able to do several months later with Google Earth satellite imagery is examine crater patterns and the shape of craters and use that to figure out the direction of fire and track that back to launch sites in Russia. Now, had this satellite information been available, within a day like this, we could have actually done that analysis as these events were occurring, and that could have actually influenced the understanding of the international community of what was actually happening on the ground. Instead, it was months later when it was really too late to do anything about it. But since then, the idea of having rapid access to satellite imagery and the value of that in understanding conflict and the impact that can have has always been something that's always been at the forefront of my mind. And really, thanks to imagery like this, we're able to actually do something that, only a few years ago wasn't really possible for small organizations like Bellingcat to do. There are other incidents where satellite imagery played a role, along with other kinds of open source data. Bucha, when Ukrainian forces entered in April 2022, had many conspiracy theories emerge after bodies were found on the streets. People claiming that bodies on the streets were actually moving and they were just actors pretending to be there. First of all, we had footage or claims from the Russian embassies, again, claiming that this footage showed that people were really moving. They were claiming the slowed down version of footage of Ukrainian troops entering the town showed a corpse moving his hand. And if you actually watch this footage, you actually see it's a water drop that's crossing across the body. It's not the body moving. And work by the New York Times actually compared that video footage to satellite imagery that showed those bodies in positions weeks before the Ukrainians entered. And that led to more extensive reporting by the New York Times using a combination of different imagery from, for example, this is Ukrainian drone imagery that you can see now, imagery from things like CCTV cameras like this one that identified massacres, individual units, victims, and other information about what really happened. And this combination of multiple sources to debunk lies, verify crimes, and do these kind of investigations is something that's incredibly valuable. And I'm really pleased to see it being done on such a large scale at this point. Another aspect of the conflict, the kind of information war, has been the way that a community is formed that is more akin to kind of early 2000s forum culture with NAFO, the North Atlantic Fellows Organization, which formed very early on in the conflict and created a real sense of community that didn't exist before. We also had sites like St. Javelin that started fundraising, selling kind of merchandise around this and building this sense of community that didn't really exist in other conflicts I've seen. And I think part of it is just because there's more engagement in this conflict. But also, I think it's a reaction to these lies that are told. People get angry, they want to respond, but sometimes the best response is just to be as annoying as possible to the people you don't like. So this kind of what you would call low quality posting is something that can really kind of destabilize the disinformation ecosystem that emerges around these conflicts, because it's one thing to be treated seriously when you're lying, like Russian government officials at the UN Security Council, but when people are just responding to you with memes and insulting you, and it's being done on a large scale, that can not be a very nice experience for the people telling the lies. Bellingcat has done a lot of work developing ideas around legal accountability. Several years ago, we started a project called the Yemen Project, where we worked with the Global Legal Action Network to develop a process for investigating war crimes in any context, really, but beginning with Yemen and Saudi coalition airstrikes. We published multiple reports. They've been submitted to various legal processes. We've worked on refining it and improving it. And now we're applying this same process on a much larger scale to the conflicts in Ukraine. It's a far more in-depth and complex process than an average open source investigation, because we have to preserve all the evidence we come across to a high evidentiary standard, have a documented process, and also ensure that we've explored every single avenue, which is very time consuming. We've produced 57 reports, some of which are more than 100 pages long of analysis of various incidents that took place in Ukraine, currently focused very much on Kharkiv and the cluster munition strikes on civilian targets early on in the conflict. And that's being made available to legal accountability organizations. We've published various reports about using open source video as evidence and different kinds of open source investigation with regards to the law of war. And we continue to develop this kind of material because there's not a lot of work that really has been done around legal accountability and the practical use of open source evidence. And we found ourselves in a fairly unique position where we're able to do this. What we're trying to do as well is also take this idea of this kind of this mapping project and create a platform that combines them into one platform that makes this video content and photographic content available to legal accountability groups. We're going to call it the Index for Accountability, and we're working with partners. And it's really trying to solve the problem of lots of organizations separately creating archives of material and then actually trying to get that material to the people who need it, turning it into kind of a 10 email situation for one incident into 2-click situation for one incident, and really removing the barrier between sharing the information with legal accountability organizations that exists at the moment. So that's Bellingcat. So I'm happy to answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you, Eliot. We can proceed with questions and first review those we already received in the chat. So we got a question from Nicholas. Nicholas, would you like to speak out loud and elaborate your question?
Hello. Thanks a lot for all the work, for the presentation. It's always very interesting to listen to you. I've been to a lot of webinars led by you. So my question pertains to FOIA. So in you're British, so in the UK would be Freedom of Information Act request that is asking for information from governments about the kind of information that they hold or they haven't published or disclosed yet. If you use that tool, do you have volunteers that help you with that?
FOIA, you mean? We don't really do many FOIA requests at the moment. It's not really stuff that has kind of been relevant to a lot of the investigations that we've been doing. So no, we're not really doing that at the moment. We've done a little bit of work. I've been working with someone recently who's been doing a lot of FOIA requests, and they found that actually ChatGPT-4 is very good at writing them because it understands freedom of information regulations very well, and it's very good at responding to refusals. But yeah, it's not something we're doing an awful lot at the moment ourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nicholas. So we have then another question from Ivan, I believe. Does Telegram still include the metadata when someone sends a picture?
Yeah, it's what a lot of people don't get about Telegram. It's the kind of key difference between other social media platforms. So there's been several incidents where kind of people sharing fake images have been caught out because the creation dates are different from what they claim, or there's metadata within those images that shows they're not taken where they were claimed to be. Like I saw one where someone had left the coordinates in of where the photograph was taken, and it made it immediately geolocatable to a completely different location. And yeah, that's still, I think, pretty unique to Telegram.
And then we have another question from Paolo. What kind of verification do you do on the notices?
And if it's regarding the stuff that we put onto the maps we're doing, so we use geolocation to do that. That will be comparing satellite imagery and other reference imagery, things like Google Street View or other photographs that have been taken on the ground at the same location, and comparing that to what's visual basically in the videos and photographs. It's kind of like spot the difference really between satellite imagery and other reference imagery and what's there. If we want to try and confirm the time of incident, we'll use a technique where we call chronolocation, which is establishing the time something was taken. So what we'll do is we'll use reference imagery, for example, like satellite imagery, to look at changes that have occurred over time and see if those changes are visible in the imagery that we have. If we want to be really precise, we can use shadows, for example, to calculate the time of day something was taken. So there's various techniques there that we can apply and use.
Then Ben was asking, where can we access the Atlos platform?
It's not something that's publicly available at the moment. We've worked with a university whose name escapes me at the time for the moment that's developed that, but it's a closed platform. It's only for volunteers. If you want to volunteer, we do have quite a large backlog of volunteers because we do ensure that all of them are trained, both with geolocation training and vicarious trauma training. But you can email contact@bellingcat.com and we can put you in contact with the people who are organizing that.
One coming from Jay. Besides social media, where do you get raw materials for analysis, such as satellite imagery in short notice? So low Earth orbit satellites don't always have coverage of the area you want to analyze, and aerial videos, etc. So.
Yeah, we use a variety of providers for kind of very like Sentinel satellites, for example. They provide imagery quite quickly. We have access to Planet Labs, for example, so we get imagery through that. There's also a surprising amount of drone imagery that comes out of this conflict. So in some incidents, it's possible to get good drone imagery of an area if you spend enough time looking for it, which can also be very useful for comparing changes over time, which is something that's very useful. There's, for example, been a recent incident where a large number of Western supplied vehicles were destroyed or damaged in one incident, and the Russians have filmed and photographed that from multiple angles, and you can actually compare the kind of how that's changed over time, how they've pulled stuff out of vehicles and done different things to them by comparing all those images in sequence. But putting them into sequence itself is a challenge, but they've used drone imagery, so it gives us a kind of overview of the area before we start looking at the ground imagery to figure out where every video is being filmed.
Somebody wants to know where do you showed some satellite images and they look as in a really high resolution. And from this person who is asking from his experience, wasn't this a high resolution, even if I believe it was, you showed Sentinel images, right, at one point?
Yeah. The Sentinel ones are quite low resolution because we were basically looking for a large area of destruction. I think the current limit on sat, I might be wrong here, but I think the current limit is 0.31 meters imagery. It's the kind of resolution that you would get from, say, if you went onto Google Earth and viewed the imagery there. If you look at a service like Planet, you get almost daily imagery at 3-meter resolution, which is okay for seeing large structural changes, but for those kind of smaller details, you miss that. But we also have an option with Planet at the moment to task satellites to certain areas. So we also, if we ever want a close look at something, we can do that, although there can be a bit of a lengthy lead time before you actually get those images. Plus you have to deal with things like clouds, which are kind of the main barrier between us and the images on the ground most times in a very literal sense.
In your line of work, I think Richard was referring to harassment in case of risks that volunteers are facing in participating in OSINT. Did you experience something?
Yeah, I mean, it's certainly, I think for like volunteers at our global authentication project, it's not an issue because we tend to keep them very low profile. We understand the risks of having kind of a public exposure. There's basically two main groups of risks: state actors and crazy people on the internet. And state actors, we've had all kinds of problems with the Russian Federation. They've tried to, so over the years, there's just been an unending list. It kind of really started with kind of the Russian state media, Sputnik and Russia Today, criticizing our work, trying to frame us make us look as suspicious as possible. Then we had organized disinformation campaigns run by the Internet Research Agency against Bellingcat, which were pretty much completely ineffectual, but they did allow us to identify the network of basically live journal blogs and other websites that were being operated, because they were basically all singing off the same hymn sheet. It was the same. They obviously had like 20 items they'd been given to write articles about, and they used 10 or 12 from each one, but it was very clear they had like spelt my name wrong in all the articles in exactly the same way and things like that. Then we started having Russian officials claiming that we were working with the British intelligence services and we were paid for by various people and stuff like that. So that started really after our investigations into the Skripal poisoning in 2018. Now we've had staff members followed, multiple attempts over the last 7 years to hack our emails in various ways, phishing attacks, DDoS attacks on our websites, all kinds of stuff like that. Usually when I do a talk and there's a Russian embassy in the area, there'll be someone from the Russian embassy sat at the back of the room taking notes about what I'm saying. So that's kind of on the state actor side of things. On the crazy people on the internet things, you tend to have people who don't like Bellingcat. I think we're the CIA or working in collusion with governments, all kinds of things like that. And a lot of those people are the kind of people who like to turn up events and try and shout at you from the crowd and that kind of stuff. So that's why I generally now only do kind of closed events rather than too many public events, because it got to the point where every single event someone would turn up and try and cause some kind of drama. And plus with those people, you don't know if one time they'll turn up with a knife or, wanting to cause you physical harm. So that's kind of like the on the other side of it as well. And I'm kind of in some senses more worried about those kinds of people, but then state actors, but then you are dealing with Russia who, they poison people. So, I guess it's apples and oranges in many senses.
Then we have another question. Fraser was asking, are there any ethical issues unique to using satellite imagery?
I mean, it's possible. I mean, it's more in the context of what you're looking at. So, for example, there's a lot of concerns from the Ukrainians that people filming and taking photographs of air defense systems in action could allow these systems to be identified, geolocating them using videos. And I think it's a legitimate concern. And because we do have this satellite imagery that is very rapidly available, it could be available, the next morning after an airstrike's been taking place. Would be possible for example to identify something like that. With open source investigation more broadly, there's a number of ethical issues we encounter. So for example, the Ukraine civilian harm map I showed you, one thing we keep in mind is whether or not the people featured in the video or filming the video could be identified based off the information we're sharing. And if that's the case, then we don't make that video public. We still have it on a kind of private database that we provide to organizations working on accountability, but we wouldn't make that information public, especially in a conflict where things like front lines do change. So what might be Ukrainian controlled one week or could be Russian controlled the following week, and those people who capture those images could be put at serious risk. So there's numerous ethical issues we come across. At Bellingcat, we actually have an ethics board to make sure we review those, and we come to a decision based off a lengthy discussion often.
Have you ever provided material, analysis, outcomes, etc., to IIIM? This is International Impartial and Independent Mechanism, right? For Syria, the UN body responsible for investigating crimes against humanity, war crimes, etc.
Yes, some information. Keith Hyatt, who's the chief evidence officer at the IIIM on Syria, he was actually someone who was very much engaged with Bellingcat's work very early on. And in fact, there's a meeting before the IIIM that was set up in The Hague where there was a large number of people from civil society, NGOs, accountability organizations who came together and had various meetings around what should the IIIM on Syria do. And Keith was a very strong advocate for open source evidence, digital evidence being something that was really a key part of the work there. So in a sense, whilst we haven't submitted like a huge amount of evidence there, our influence there has been more through kind of the understanding of the value of open source evidence and analysis. So a lot of the work early on setting up that team at the IIIM in Syria was focused on digital evidence and how to use that, which was something very new and unique. It created its own challenges. So one of the ideas is all these organizations who had gathered data could have a kind of digital and real evidence vault based at the IIIM, but it became very apparent that a lot of organizations didn't want to share data in that way because they had concerns around access and security. So this led to this idea of the Index for Accountability, where organizations could control their own archives, but make that archive materials available in a centralized index that could be then searched by the likes of the ICC or the IIIM or any other accountability body.
Somebody was wondering if you can recommend to us some venues or literature for improving one's OSINT skills, whether geospatial related or otherwise.
I mean, we do, and it's like on Bellingcat, we have a lot of guides and case studies that are intended for people to learn about that kind of thing directly. There are a number of books out there about open source investigation, but one problem is because you're dealing with technology that constantly changes and innovates, they're very rapidly, some of these books become out of date. There's things like the Verification Handbook, for example, which was several editions of that, and that was free online. But again, because these things change very rapidly, often stuff becomes out of date. Something as simple as like a API change on Twitter can kind of destroy a whole range of different tools and techniques overnight. So the best thing to do is kind of really engage with the people who are kind of writing this stuff, publishing stuff. Bellingcat does that, and we write material around getting people the kind of skills they need to do that kind of work.
Oscar was asking what conflicts in the world today would you say are underreported on from the perspective of open source intelligence?
I mean, frankly, it's anything that isn't Ukraine. There's a vast amount of information that could be gathered about conflicts. I mean, it's difficult for us because we understand that, I mean, we're a small organization. We have 30 people. Investigating a single incident in a conflict like Ukraine using open source evidence, if you do it to the level of really legal accountability, it's at least a full week of work for one person, usually at least two, and then another week on top of that of review and checking. So one incident, which in terms of, say, you know, a missile hitting a building and documenting it fully for legal accountability could take 3 weeks. And obviously there's many, many more incidents than that in a conflict, with over 1,000 civilian harm incidents mapped on the Ukraine map we've created. So part of the work we're trying to do is build these methods and technologies and just distribute them as widely as possible, train other organizations to use them, so we don't kind of end up with this investigative bottleneck that we're facing all the time at the moment. And I don't really envision Bellingcat as an organization that's going to have, you know, 10,000 employees looking at every conflict in the world. It's more that we'll teach other people how to do that. So it's also not, we're not like defining the terms of which things should be investigated. It's up to the people who want to do that to learn how to do it, and we'll give them the tools and the ideas and the training to do that.
Then we have another question referring to satellite imagery. What kind of software or website which is offering up-to-date satellite imagery do you use, or do you switch between different solutions? What is your case?
It varies. I mean, generally day to day we'll be using Planet if we want to have a quick look somewhere. If we need to kind of extend our search for any reason, we'll just use as many providers as we can kind of reach out to, Maxar and people like that. Most of it is behind subscriptions, so unfortunately there's not really a free option to get that kind of imagery quickly. Although now you do have satellite imagery companies becoming more aware of the value of sharing that kind of imagery. So they'll often send out emails with kind of this imagery attached to journalists and other subscribers, so they can they don't necessarily have to pay to see this stuff. But if you're looking for stuff that's, you know, not the biggest news item, that's not going to be much help.
How can we benefit from OSINT investigation training from Bellingcat?
So we offer various workshops that people can sign up for. We also do workshops that are for specific organizations. We don't train anything to do with intelligence or government or law enforcement, with a few exceptions around things related to things like child abuse. But generally we'll train most organizations. There's a workshop section on Bellingcat. And again, we do try and make as much kind of free material as possible. We have a YouTube channel that has various videos explaining our tools and techniques and ideas. We have a Discord server where people can come and interact with each other and pick through information. And if you want to kind of be part of a community and learn skills, that's a really good place to go. We're very much believers that a big part of open source investigation is community as much as the tools and the techniques. And it's something that we've used a lot in our work, and Twitter really was the place to go for that. There was a really great open source community there, but I think everyone's quite worried about the future of Twitter. So we're trying to diversify the platforms we use to kind of serve that community at the moment.
Faisal from Sudan was wondering, how do you keep your mental health as an OSINT volunteer, for example, seeing all these things?
Yeah, there's various techniques you can do as part of the investigations. One thing we try to do when you're watching a video, unless you really need to listen to the audio for some reason, turn the audio off, because that has a kind of deeper impact than you might realize when you're watching videos. We've just actually had a hackathon where someone developed a tool that allows you to blur out images within your browser. So if you're looking at an image that might have a body in it, and you can blur that out very easily. And generally speaking, if you're looking at something where part of the image, for example, might show something horrible, but that horrible thing isn't actually relevant to your investigation because you might be looking at something in the background, block that out completely. Just go into a photo editing thing and just block it out. Also take breaks. Don't just spend the entire day looking at horrible stuff, because that just builds up over time. Make sure you have set limits to yourself. And I think one thing that has concerned me a lot about the conflicts in Ukraine is how it was very clear that many people spend their entire day just scrolling through social media, looking at videos from the conflict, some of which are really disturbing. And kind of the more your kind of values are connected to the victims in the conflict, then the more traumatic that can be. So really managing that kind of vicarious trauma is something that's very important. And we've actually published a number of guides on trauma on the Bellingcat website, talking about how you can handle that, which I posted in chat at the moment.
Thank you. So we also have one comment or question. Reports based on OSINT can sometimes backfire for those of journalists living in the dictatorial country. They may use them against us, leading to accusations of defamation. Is there any advice regarding this matter?
It's a fairly big and complex subject because it can impact things in different ways. So, for example, we've worked with partners in Russia for a long time, and since May 2021, there's really been a crackdown on Russian journalists that really escalated following the invasion of Ukraine, and that extended to any opposition figure or really any critics of what was happening. And we were declared a undesirable organization of foreign agent in Russia that had implications for any organization who operates in Russia who has any connection with Bellingcat. So that's kind of one thing we've had to keep an eye on. There's also that if you're working with journalists in a local, any local context, you need to be aware of the risks that are presented to them by publishing information that they may have collaborated with you on or provided you with. On the other hand, it also means that it's harder to shut down for governments and those in the position of authority to shut down their critics, because if you're if you're a local news organization that's connected to a network of global organizations and you are willing to take those risks, you also have partners in other countries who those governments can't really reach in many senses. I mean, of course, we still have countries who are happy to send, threats and assassinations in the direction of their critics outside of the state, but that kind of global networks, I think, kind of can counteract some of the attempts to undermine it, and also gives a way to amplify things when there are attacks on those local journalists.
Would you say that through OSINT work like yours, informants and sources have lost value?
I think there actually might be a perception in a sense that I think you have a few factors going on. I think one thing is there's been a loss of trust in kind of traditional sources of authority, be it the government, the media, even medical professionals, among many people. Some of it is deserved, some of it isn't. And what that means is when you have a newspaper that's saying, oh, an anonymous source told us that, people are less inclined to trust the newspaper in that source. So with open source investigation, because we were able to show the videos and photographs, that almost becomes the expectation of what you should get. And that in one way is good because having visual evidence to prove something is useful. But on the other hand, just having the assumption that something's not true because there's not a video or photograph attached is also pretty bad. But I think these attempts by news media to start using things like open source investigation and visual investigation has acted to counteract that to a certain degree. But trust is something that's pretty hard to earn back once you've lost it. And there are news organizations and governments and individuals with an influence who, have lost that trust, and building that back up is something that's quite difficult. But I think open source investigation is one way to help build trust. It's just, not a simple thing to do when you have lost trust.
Then Lorenzo was asking, can you repeat how do you determine when an image was taken?
Okay, so there's a number of ways of doing this. So one simple way is using shadows and measuring the direction of shadows. It's basically the sundial method. Once you know you've geolocated a photograph, you know the position of the camera, so you know which direction shadows are pointing. You can measure things like length in comparison to, say, a vehicle, and that can be used to establish the time of day something was taken. As for the date it was taken on, there's various methods there as well. One can be looking at, for example, if you have regular satellite imagery of a location and you can see things like changes in structures, in a conflict zone, buildings are blown up, they're destroyed, or fields are burnt, or things like that. You can actually see that sequence and see how it's changing. In one investigation we did, we were looking into one of the Skripal suspects. He had gone to the Czech Republic and taken a photograph in a town square, and we wanted to establish the time when that photograph was taken. And because that square is a popular tourist destination, there's a huge number of videos and photographs taken of it every single day. So we had the time the photograph was taken, and we can actually sequence about a month's worth of videos and photographs taken at different times of days to see when windows were open in the background and when certain street furniture was in different positions. And that allowed us to narrow down the day it was taken on. So it's really just kind of finding as many sources as possible where there's observable changes over time, and then putting them into sequence and seeing where the image you have fits into that sequence.
We got another question from Nick. How much have you moved to the use of artificial intelligence, especially the specific ones like plant recognition or potential area recognition? Are there any specific ones you would recommend that aren't widely known about?
Sometimes we'll use tools, something as simple as Google Lens, identify a plant that's in a video and then, or photograph, figure out which region that grows in. I've been playing around with some of the popular AI tools to see how good they are at faking things. So I use Midjourney to try and fake real life locations, and it was absolutely rubbish at doing that. Because I think there's a lot of concerns that all these AI images will be used to create fake evidence, but because geolocation is kind of like a core part of verification, you can't geolocate an AI generated image because it can't really realistically create locations that are perfect enough to not be picked up in that process. I've been using ChatGPT quite a bit for a variety of different things. One as a kind of writing aid. Sometimes I'll, if I formulate a paragraph and I think that's just terribly written, I'll get it to do that. It's not a great research tool, and I've been using things like Google Bard, the Bing AI, and a few others to try and do research, and it hallucinates too much. It creates false links and information. I was asking Google Bard to give information about myself, and it was just making stuff about me, and that's supposed to be, that was drawing directly from Wikipedia, and it was just completely wrong and not even what was on Wikipedia. But there's some interesting tools like ChatGPT has plugins now that one of them allows you to basically point it towards a PDF file, and then you can run queries on the contents of that PDF file. And I have to use it if I get a really long academic paper, I'll use it to kind of summarize the key points. And of course, if I'm going to use something, I'll double check it. I'll never use it as a primary source, but it can help you save an awful lot of time when it comes to that. On the other hand, though, if I was going to be involved with creating disinformation, in the past, we've seen fake news websites set up where what they'll do is they'll copy articles from other stories, reword them slightly, and then publish them over a series of months. and then after a certain amount of time start creating fake stories. The problem is they're easy to pick up because those stories they copy tend to, still use the same words or sequences of words, which means they can be searched on Google and discovered. What you can do with AI is just basically plunk an article into something like ChatGPT and say, rewrite this in this style, and it will give you what appears to be a unique article. And then you can actually automatically generate a large amount of content very quickly, basically just on ChatGPT rewriting articles. You can in fact create Twitter threads based off that and have that tweeted out as well, and create a whole kind of website and social media apparatus that is generated basically just from ChatGPT working with text. Now you can do that at the moment. It's not perfect, but we're still in very early iterations of AI and generated text. And I'm sure that's going to improve in the long term. I'm kind of less worried about fake videos and photographs from the context of evidence and investigation, but from the context of kind of social media sharing and things going viral, that's kind of far more of a concern, because until we start having a thing where social media platforms can automatically detect AI generated imagery, I think there's going to be a risk that one of these images has a very significant impact, and we've seen a little bit of that happening already.
So, Eliot, are you up for 2 more questions?
Sure.
And we can start wrapping it up. So we have one more question from Ralph. He's guessing disinformation efforts are becoming more sophisticated as the actors learn from their mistakes. Do you see this happening? And if so, how much harder does it make investigations? Do you need new approaches, tools to stay ahead of them?
Well, I assume that would be the case in February 2022 with the invasion of Russia into Ukraine. I thought surely they've learned all the lessons from us constantly catching them out and debunking them. But no, it was exactly the same quality of lies and disinformation. What had changed, though, is there are a lot more people aware of what they do and how they do it. So they were actually being debunked far more rapidly. So I've not really seen any more kind of sophisticated disinformation campaigns than we've seen previously.
Christian was asking, have you used video footage on ground and from drone to reconstruct the scenes into 3D models with photogrammetry, which can give even more details about shoot directions or destructions? These 3D models can be georeferenced and placed on a map to show before and after destruction scenes into greater detail.
We've used a bit of it. Really, the main time I've used it in my own research is there was a video shared of an unexploded bomb in Syria, and it was a very rare type of chemical bomb. But to confirm that, I need to actually get measurements of it. So an organization called Forensic Architecture, who do really fantastic work, and I recommend you look them up. They use photogrammetry a lot. So they took the video, used it to create a photogrammetry scene, used information we already knew about the bomb and its measurements to measure part of it, and then they could project that measurement across the entire bomb, and it fit perfectly to what we were looking for. So that's kind of one example where we've used it. There was a market bombing in Syria that we looked into, and we used photogrammetry of drone footage to recreate that scene. So yeah, I think it can be a very valuable technique, and if you're looking for more of that work, search for Forensic Architecture, because they've used photogrammetry a great deal, and they've done some really interesting things with that.
Okay, and I think we have time for one more last question. So Jan was asking, on one hand, Sentinel Hub offers a normal true color view as seen by the human eye. And his question is, do you at Bellingcat also use the numerous other possibilities that Sentinel Hub offers? For example, composites with frequency bands that the human eye cannot perceive, or for example, with the aim of making heat, biomass, water surfaces, or burned land even more visible. So he's referring also to custom scripts, I guess.
Yeah, if you go to the Bellingcat website, under the tools, we've been using SAR imagery to examine grain shipments and looking at ports where these ships have been turning up, and we've developed some tools around that. we're constantly trying to use different ideas and different types of imagery. We're trying to look more in kind of environmental damage and using that kind of imagery to do that. But yeah, I would definitely recommend checking that latest those articles that you can find on the Bellingcat website.
Thank you. I think we used our time and your time, Eliot. It was really wonderful to talk to you. It was great to have you as a guest. I would just like to say to participants that for more questions, you can also write to Eliot via Twitter, right?
Yep.
And
Higgins on Twitter.
And you can also ask you more technical related questions to Sentinel Hub on our forum. Thank you all for being with us today. A big thanks to you, Eliot, of course. Thanks, everyone. And I invite you to see us the next time. Thank you, Eliot.
Thank you, everyone.